by a grant from Mobile Corporation.
Good evening, and welcome to a very special night of mystery. I'm Vincent Price. In just a moment, you're going to see the first episode in a series of 7 truly classic mystery stories, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. For almost a century, Sherlock Holmes has been considered the most brilliant detective ever created in fiction. Arthur Conan Doyle could have had no inkling that his Victorian consulting detective would endure and become the most revered and the most meticulously documented character in the world of mystery and crime. Now, why, you may ask, did Sherlock Holmes have almost immediate and phenomenal global appeal? Well, I think the eminent Sherlockian Edgar Smith touched upon the answer when he wrote that the stories of the great detective have the appeal of the half-remembered, half-forgotten time, of smug Victorian illusion, of gaslit comfort and contentment, of perfect dignity and grace. Holmes was the epitome of the Victorian gentleman in that era when the British were a nation of peace, of work, and of consummate morals. And in a period in history when an Englishman's word was truly his bond. Mastery of science and technology, Victorians believed that they were in control of their environment, and their optimism allowed them to be wholly untouched by any concern for the long-term consequences of their material progress and empirical exploitations. In late Victorian England, people believed in order, and the world was seen as possessing a mechanistic simplicity. How right, then, was this scientifically inquisitive age for the emergence of the consulting detective Sherlock Holmes. The proud Victorian principle of applied science lent itself perfectly to Holmes's scientific method of investigation, culminating in his meticulous reason by deduction. Readers continue to clamor for Holmes as much today as they ever did. Opinion polls consistently show that tonight's episode, Scandal in Bohemia, remains the all-time favorite. Could this be because it was the first adventure to be published in the Strand magazine in July of 1891? I think it's because in this story, and in this story only, Sherlock Holmes encounters the incomparable Irena Adler. Holmes's scientific method of detection employed his extensive knowledge of such diverse things as typefaces, perfumes, tobaccos, footprints, even tattoos. All this, as well as his knowledge of the history of crime, made Holmes, even as a university undergraduate, a man that Scotland Yard was fortunate to know, especially when Victorian London's rough-and-ready methods of investigation proved fruitless. I know you'll want to join me next week for one of the most popular stories, The Adventure of the Speckled Band. Until then, for Mystery, I'm Vincent Price. Good night. How much alike were Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes? Well, the similarities between them were very apparent to many, and the popular author received thousands of letters from readers asking him to investigate cases which they felt the police had not handled properly. Conan Doyle did actually take on a number of these investigations, and was instrumental in reversing several famous miscarriages of justice. Next week, Sherlock Holmes solves a strange and menacing puzzle in The Adventure of the Dancing Men. I hope you'll join me. Until then, for Mystery, I'm Vincent Price. Good night. Good evening, I'm Vincent Price, and welcome again to Gory Mansion, where we'll see the third story in the new, and it seems to me, the definitive dramatizations of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. You know, I'm sure that I am not alone when I invariably visualize the great detective in his famous deerstalker cap and Inverness cape, making his way through foggy London streets, removing his curved meerschaum pipe from his mouth to utter an occasional elementary, "My dear Watson." And yet, that familiar impression, for the most part, is not representative of author Conan Doyle's character. Though they have become part of the Sherlock Holmes lore, they reflect more the concepts of illustrators and dramatic interpreters than they do Doyle's writing. The Sherlock Holmes adventures, like the stories of Charles Dickens, were first published in a magazine, London's legendary Strand magazine. Sidney Paget was the most famous illustrator of the Doyle stories, and he depicted the detective in hundreds of engravings. Paget himself used to wear a deerstalker hat or fore and aft when he went tramping across the countryside, so it's not surprising that he drew Holmes in the same type of cap, but only when the great man's adventures took him to the country. Similarly, Paget illustrated Holmes on many train journeys in the very practical Inverness cape, which gentlemen of the period wore to protect their finer clothes from railway soot and cinders, as well as from the damp and drafts. Of course, what happened was that Paget's drawings gave readers an indelibly memorable picture of Holmes, and they became the model for countless other artists and actors who presented Holmes in cap and cape no matter where the tenacious detective pursued his villains. There is a worldwide revival of interest in Holmes as a literary character, and it is this interest in the Doyle texts themselves which convinced Britain's Granada television to film these faithful versions. The transition from print to film often made some very heavy demands on the screenwriters, as did the need to clarify Doyle's obvious inconsistencies and contradictions in many of the very hastily written stories. But the production collaborators were able, without slavishly adhering to every word that the Victorian author wrote, to fashion authentic adaptations of the original stories, as you'll see now in one of the most famous stories, The Adventure of the Dancing Men. Next week, Sherlock Holmes is called into the world of political and military intrigue as he tackles the adventure of the naval treaty. Until then, for Mystery, I'm Vincent Price. Good night. Tonight, the fourth story in our series, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Dr. Watson, in speaking of the keen detective, once lamented that the stage lost a fine actor, even as science lost an acute reasoner, when Holmes became a specialist in crime. Well, Watson needn't have worried too much about the loss to the stage, for quite a few actors have become Sherlock Holmes on the stage, in the movie. In our new dramatic series, Jeremy Brett provides us with an exquisitely honed performance, which, by the way, the London Times recently declared the best Holmes ever. Brett joins a distinguished brotherhood of actors who have interpreted Conan Doyle's character, including Sir John Gielgud, Sir Cedric Hardwicke, Sir Ralph Richardson, George C. Scott, and John Barrymore. A few seasons ago, Jeremy Brett played Watson to Charlton Heston's Sherlock in Los Angeles, which Brett says helped him enormously in the development of his relationship with Watson in this Granada television series, and does, I think, create new dimensions in that famous friendship. Watson previously has been most often depicted as a bumbling, slow-witted clod. Conan Doyle often used contemporary history as a basis for some of Sherlock Holmes' original adventures. In 1887, England and Italy had negotiated a maritime agreement which at all costs they wanted kept secret from France and Russia. This document and the intrigue surrounding it suggested to the popular author the beginnings of Holmes' involvement in the adventure of the Naval Treaty. After a few eminently forgettable stage productions by other writers appeared in Britain, Conan Doyle decided to write his own 5-act play about Holmes. He sent it to the famous actor-manager Beerbohm Tree, who wanted to make so many revisions that the author withdrew it. A few years later, the script came into the hands of the famous American actor William Gillette. Gillette also wanted to make changes, but by this time, Doyle had become more flexible. May I marry Holmes? Gillette asked Doyle. And the famous author replied, you may marry him or murder him or do what you like with him. Conan Doyle never ceased to deprecate what today we recognize as his finest creation, and he wrote in his thanks to Gillette, to the man who changed a creature of thin air into an absolutely convincing human being. Next week, Mystery will bring you another very faithful adaptation, The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist. Until then, I'm Vincent Price. Good night.
Mystery is made possible by a grant from Mobile Corporation.